Dearest listeners, before we discuss a love that began not with a glance, but with the turning of a page, allow this author a small indulgence. If my stories bring you delight, I implore you to grant me a token of your esteem with a like, to subscribe so that my future dispatches always find you, and to leave a comment below. This author is most curious to learn from which corner of the world you are listening. Now, with such pleasantries attended to, let us proceed. Our tale begins, as all the most delicious stories do, in the glittering ballrooms of London during the height of the season. Miss Charlotte Fairchild, gentle listeners, picture if you will a young lady of 20 summers with the unfortunate habit of preferring Byron to balls, had been quite contentedly invisible for 2 seasons running. While her elder sister, the incomparable Miss Lydia Fairchild, collected suitors like some ladies collect ribbons, our Charlotte had perfected the art of becoming one with the wallpaper. This author has it on excellent authority that Charlotte possessed a rather singular talent. She could render herself so thoroughly unremarkable that even the most desperate fortune hunters passed her by without a second glance. Her soft brown hair, pinned in the simplest style fashion would permit, her modest morning dresses in shades of sage and dove gray, her quiet demeanor, all conspired to create a young lady who moved through society like a ghost at a feast. At the Danbury Ball last month, this author witnessed young Lord Finchley, whose pockets were so empty they practically echoed, look directly at Charlotte before turning to his companion and declaring loudly that there was not a single eligible lady to be found in that corner of the room. Charlotte, to her credit, merely turned a page of the poetry volume hidden behind her fan. But oh, dearest listeners, what the ton failed to notice. For behind those unremarkable hazel eyes lived a mind that devoured philosophy and poetry with equal appetite. While other young ladies memorized the latest dance steps, Charlotte memorized Shakespeare's sonnets. While they practiced their pianoforte, she taught herself Italian to read Dante in the original. Her father's extensive library had become her sanctuary, her refuge from a world that valued beauty over brilliance. Just this afternoon, before the great crush of the Pemberton Ball, this author is aware that a small scene unfolded in that very library. Charlotte was found by her mother, not preparing her attire, but hunched over a volume of Locke, a frown of intense concentration on her face. Mrs. Fairchild sighed, the sound a familiar melody of maternal exasperation. She gently chided her daughter for empoisoning her mind with philosophy when she should be considering which ribbons best complemented her eyes. "No gentleman wishes to discuss metaphysics, Charlotte," she had lamented. "He wishes for a pretty partner who can follow his lead. You shall be quite impossible to marry off at this rate." Charlotte had merely offered a quiet apology, the words a shield for the vibrant world of ideas her mother could not, or would not, understand. One must confess that this author found it rather tragic, not Charlotte's bookish nature, heavens no, but society's blindness to the treasure in their midst. For what use is beauty without substance? What value a pretty face attached to an empty head? But I digress, as I so often do when the topic turns to the failures of our supposed betters. It was at Lady Pemberton's annual ball, that monument to excess where even the flowers seem to sweat from the crush, that our story truly begins. Charlotte had secured her favorite spot behind a rather imposing potted palm, a small volume of Wordsworth concealed in her reticule. She had become quite expert at reading whilst appearing to merely observe the dancing, turning pages in rhythm with the quadrille. The Fairchild family's attendance followed a predictable pattern. Mr. Fairchild would disappear into the card room. Mrs. Fairchild would orbit her beautiful eldest daughter like a particularly determined planet around the sun. And Charlotte? Charlotte would find the nearest architectural foliage and commence her literary pursuits. Enter Lord Nicholas Ashford, a name that carried its own weight in society. At 26, his lordship had recently returned from a rather extended sojourn on the continent. The gossips whispered that he'd left England 3 years prior with the reputation of a rake that would make even Lord Byron blush. But the man who returned? Well, that was quite another creature entirely. Gone was the carelessly tousled hair and the sardonic smile. In its place stood a gentleman of serious mien, his dark hair severely styled, his evening clothes impeccable but austere. Some said he'd suffered a disappointment in Italy. Others claimed he'd found religion. This author suspected the truth was far more interesting, a man who had looked into the mirror of his own excess and found himself wanting. On this particular evening, Lord Ashford found himself in the unfortunate position of being hunted. The ambitious mamas of the town had descended upon him like particularly well-dressed vultures. In his desperate flight from the approaching Duchess of Witherby and her triple threat of triplet daughters, his lordship ducked behind the very same potted palm that sheltered our Charlotte. This author nearly expired from delight when witness to what followed. The collision was soft but decisive. Charlotte, deep in contemplation of Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, suddenly found herself pressed against warm, superfine, and sandalwood cologne. Her book tumbled from nerveless fingers, saved from the floor only by his lordship's quick reflexes. For a suspended moment they stood frozen, the hunted lord and the invisible miss, both refugees from the glittering battlefield beyond their green sanctuary. Lord Ashford's recognition of the poetry was instantaneous. A sense sublime, of something far more deeply interfused, he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through Charlotte herself. She looked up in shock. It was one thing for a gentleman to recognize a famous poem. It was another entirely to quote its very heart with such quiet understanding. The transformation of Charlotte's face in that moment, from mortification to utter breathtaking wonder, was something this author shall never forget. Their subsequent conversation broke every rule of proper introduction. "I must confess," he said, his eyes still on the book, "I did not expect to find Wordsworth in this particular jungle." "And I, my lord," Charlotte replied, finding her voice, "did not expect to find a gentleman who could quote him." "A low bar for a gentleman, is it not?" he asked, a faint, wry smile touching his lips for the first time. "I had thought a passing knowledge of the Lake poets was still required, even in these fallen times." "A passing knowledge of their names, perhaps," she countered, a spark of her true self emerging. "But not of their meaning. Most consider poetry a mere accomplishment, like needlepoint." The look of profound recognition he gave her was more intimate than any touch. They spoke then, not as strangers, but as fellow exiles. About the loneliness of being surrounded by people who spoke a different language, about finding truth in a world obsessed with surfaces. He confessed his preference for Byron's darker verses, the ones that spoke of redemption. She admitted to finding Keats almost too beautiful to bear. They discovered a mutual appreciation for Gothic novels and a shared skepticism of Coleridge's later work. For Charlotte, who had only ever had such conversations with the authors themselves on the printed page, it felt like coming home. For Nicholas, this author surmises, it was like finding a spring of fresh water after years in a desert of polite, meaningless chatter. He found himself studying the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of a particular stanza, the small, passionate gesture of her hand, and felt a pull more potent than any famed beauty had ever elicited. When Charlotte finally offered her name, reluctantly, as though afraid it would break the spell, this author observed the exact moment Lord Ashford made the connection to the beautiful Lydia. His glance toward the dance floor, where Lydia held court, lasted mere seconds before returning to Charlotte with something approaching palpable relief. 30 minutes they spent in that green sanctuary, and when they finally parted, driven by propriety, both wore the dazed expression of castaways who had unexpectedly found land. The next morning, in his Mayfair residence, Lord Ashford stood before his hearth, the copy of Wordsworth he had purchased at Hatchard's that very morning lying open on the mantel. But he was not reading. He was merely staring into the fire, replaying every word of the previous night's conversation. "Find out everything you can about her," he said to his valet, his voice quiet but firm. "Not Miss Fairchild, Miss Charlotte Fairchild. But, dearest listeners, if only love ran as smooth as a literary discussion." The next morning brought complications. Lord Ashford, calling at the Fairchild residence, encountered Lydia, radiant and assuming his call was for her. Charlotte, convinced the previous evening had been a dream, had barricaded herself in the library with a migraine that fooled no one. His lordship spent an agonizing hour trapped in the Fairchild's drawing room. "The weather is most unpredictable, is it not, my lord?" Lydia chirped. "Indeed, Miss Fairchild," he replied, his eyes scanning the doorway. "Almost as unpredictable as the critical reception of new poetry." Lydia laughed, a tinkling sound devoid of understanding. "Oh, poetry. Charlotte is the one for that. Such a peculiar girl. Do you take sugar, my lord?" His attempts to steer the conversation were met with a baffling wall of bonnets, balls, and the latest fashions from Paris. He gripped his teacup so tightly that hairline cracks appeared in the Fairchild's second-best china. Thus began 3 weeks of the most exquisite torture. He called faithfully, only to be met by Lydia. He haunted bookshops and literary salons in vain. Charlotte, meanwhile, perfected the art of strategic retreat, developing an uncanny ability to sense his presence and flee. Once, and this author blushes to report it, she actually climbed through a ground-floor window at the Ashfords' garden party rather than encounter him on the terrace. The ton drew their own conclusions. Lord Ashford's persistent calls, combined with Lydia's beauty, painted a clear picture. Wagers appeared at White's. Charlotte, hearing the whispers, retreated further into her books, convinced she was watching the man who had touched her soul court, her perfect sister. She began to fade like a pressed flower. It was Lydia who found her one afternoon, curled in a window seat in the quietest part of the house. A volume of tragic poetry open but unread in her lap, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time, this author noted, a look of genuine concern replaced Lydia's usual bright confidence. She smoothed her sister's hair, her expression a confused mixture of pity and dawning understanding. Perhaps, she began to suspect, this was not merely a case of bookish melancholy. The crisis point arrived at the Duchess of Kent's musical evening. Charlotte, dragged from her exile by maternal decree, sought refuge in the Duchess's legendary library. She stood before the poetry section when footsteps interrupted her solitude. Her panicked grab for Paradise Lost fooled no one, least of all Lord Ashford. "Miss Fairchild," he began, his voice tight with weeks of frustration, "am I truly so fearsome that you must flee my presence at every turn?" "My lord, I was merely seeking quiet," she stammered. "You should be in the salon. My sister." "I have no interest in your sister," he finally burst out, the words a shock in the silent room. "I have spent weeks attempting to speak with you. I have read poetry until my eyes ached, hoping to find something new to discuss with you. Why do you continue to hide from me?" The confession hung in the air, fragile and astonishing. But fate, cruel mistress, chose that moment for Lydia's entrance. Her bright assumption that Lord Ashford would escort them both back to the salon shattered the moment. Charlotte retreated behind her mask of invisibility, and his lordship, bound by propriety, could only offer his arms and curse silently. The aftermath was swift. Lydia, having observed the charged atmosphere, now misunderstood in a new direction. She concluded his lordship was using her to gain inappropriate access to Charlotte, perhaps for some untoward purpose. The resulting rumor horrified Mrs. Fairchild, who forbade Charlotte from being alone with his lordship, and Mr. Fairchild, who delivered a blistering set-down that sent Lord Ashford from their door. 3 days of silent torment followed. The storm broke at Lord and Lady Morrison's ball. Lord Ashford arrived like an avenging angel. But Lydia, in what she believed to be kindness, intercepted him before the entire assembly. her public acknowledgement that his heart lay elsewhere, his equally public confirmation that it had been engaged since encountering a young lady reading Wordsworth created a scene for the ages. All eyes turned to Charlotte. The whispers were like a physical blow. She rose on trembling legs, overturned a small table of refreshments in her haste, and fled as though pursued by demons. London awoke to a thunderstorm. Lord Ashford, pushed beyond patience, arrived at the Fairchild residence at an unconscionably early hour, soaked to the skin and demanding entrance. What followed was a declaration that shook the household. His announcement that he had never been courting Lydia, that he was desperately in love with Charlotte, that he demanded to hear rejection from her own lips, all delivered while dripping rainwater onto Mrs. Fairchild's prized Persian carpet, created a tableau this author wishes she could have captured in oils. Charlotte's appearance at the top of the stairs, wrapped in a shawl, transformed her from invisible miss to Gothic heroine. Her whispered question, seeking confirmation of what she could scarcely credit, drew from his lordship a confession that would have melted harder hearts than occupied that entrance hall. He spoke of love from their first meeting, his weeks of bungled courtship, his frustration at creating the most spectacular muddle in recent memory. When Charlotte descended those stairs, her confession of believing everyone would prefer Lydia's beauty drew an impassioned speech about the superiority of authentic brilliance over symmetric features. But it was his next revelation that truly captured the moment's perfection. "I fled to Italy 3 years ago," he confessed, his voice dropping. "Running from a life of such dazzling emptiness, it threatened to consume me. It was why, when I found you, a soul so real, so full of substance behind that potted palm, I knew I had found everything I had unknowingly been searching for." His confession that he had been secretly studying poetry to understand the woman who had captured his heart struck Charlotte mute. Still dripping rainwater, he dropped to one knee, producing his grandmother's ring. His proposal, promising to read every book she recommended, to never interrupt her library time, and to spend his life proving that love at first conversation surpassed love at first sight, drew tears from even this hardened chronicler. Charlotte's acceptance, whispered, then repeated with growing joy, created a moment of such perfect understanding that even the thunder outside seemed to pause in respect. And then, gentle listeners, he kissed her, right there in the entrance hall. When they parted, Lydia's delighted applause and shocking revelation that she had been attempting to throw them together all along, her misguided efforts being the cause of half the confusion, added a comic note to the morning's drama. The wedding took place 6 weeks later. Charlotte wore her grandmother's pearls and carried a bouquet of white roses tied with ribbon embossed with lines from Wordsworth. This author even overheard Mrs. Fairchild whisper to her husband, "Well, I suppose an extensive library is as fine a dowry as any, especially when it comes with a title. A most pragmatic, and thus most fitting, maternal blessing." Before the ceremony, this author witnessed Lydia embrace her sister, whispering an apology for her clumsiness and a heartfelt wish for her happiness. Their honeymoon, spent touring the great libraries of Europe, produced a correspondence filled with discoveries both literary and personal. They returned to London for the next season, where Lord and Lady Ashford became famous for hosting intimate salons. This author had the pleasure of attending one such evening. The air crackled not with gossip, but with lively debate. Charlotte, now a confident hostess, moved through the room with quiet grace, guiding a discussion on Kant, while Nicholas watched her, his expression one of absolute adoration. They had created their own society, one where wallflowers found themselves suddenly visible, and where more than one romance bloomed over a shared appreciation of a well-turned phrase. Their library, this author has heard, contains matching reading chairs positioned to catch the best light, with a small table between them, perfect for sharing particularly delightful passages. Above the mantel hangs a painting, not a formal portrait, but a scene of two people reading in comfortable silence, their free hands intertwined. And now, dearest listeners, I must turn to you. Does the tale of a love born from whispered poetry and stolen glances find favor with you? Your likes are a most welcome compliment, and I am always eager to peruse your thoughts on the matter in the comments below. To ensure you are alerted the very moment my next dispatch is made public, do subscribe and perhaps even engage that curious little bell icon. A rather insistent contrivance, I am told, but a most effective one for ensuring one never misses the latest news. And so, gentle listeners, another tale reaches its blessed conclusion. This author withdraws until our next encounter, leaving you with this thought. The greatest love stories are not always about the most beautiful or the most accomplished, but about two souls who speak the same language, even if that language happens to be written in the pages of a poetry book hidden behind a potted palm. Until then, remember, the greatest scandals often lead to the greatest happiness. Your devoted chronicler, Lady Ravenswood.